Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professors Sunita Sah and Ethan Kross. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Sunita Sah is an award-winning associate professor at Cornell University's S.C. Johnson College of Business and an expert in organizational psychology. She leads groundbreaking research on influence, authority, compliance, and defiance. A trained physician, she practiced medicine in the United Kingdom and worked as a management consultant for the pharmaceutical industry. She currently teaches executives, leaders, and students in healthcare and business. Joining her is Ethan Kross, author of the international bestseller Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. He is one of the world's leading experts on emotion regulation. Don't we all need him for a friend? An award-winning professor in the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business. He studies how the conversations people have with themselves impact their health, performance, decisions, and relationships. His forthcoming book is Shift, Managing Your Emotions so they don't manage you. And we are thrilled to be setting a date shortly to host Ethan for that book. It's excellent. And now let's welcome Sunita Sah and Ethan Kross to FAN.
Oh, thanks for that lovely introduction. And Sunita, it is just a real privilege to be talking to you today. And I must admit that I've really been looking forward to this conversation, more so than I would typically, because something actually happened in my personal life just a few days ago that really highlighted for me just how important your book and your work is. A friend called me and he was really up in arms. He had just the night before had dinner with his partner and another couple. And during the dinner, one member of the other couple said something that completely shook my friend. It just it countered everything that he believed in. And he said nothing during the dinner to contradict the point of view. As soon as the dinner was done, he got into the car with his partner and he lost it. You know, he's how could they say that? And blah, 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 blah. But in the exact moment, nothing actually occurred. This gets to the very heart, I think, of what you are writing about. And so I'd love to just start off by asking you what I've just described, I think, is an incredibly common human experience. Why does it happen? And what does it mean about us? Are we all just giant, cowardly hypocrites, or is there more hope that we should have for ourselves?
Thank you, Ethan. That's such a common example that we hear all the time. Either somebody says something at the dinner table or in a work meeting or in a school meeting, parental meeting, and you feel like you should say something, but something stops you, something prevents you from speaking up. And there could be a number of reasons for this, why we don't speak up when we really want to speak up, and then we regret not saying anything. So there's three key reasons I found in my research. So the first one is that we feel a lot of pressure from others to behave in a way that they expect. And in these types of scenarios, there's some unspoken rules that we are polite, that we want harmonious relationships, that we don't want to confront someone else. And I also, in my research, have discovered this psychological process that I call insinuation anxiety, which is that it's really hard to say something that insinuates that the other person is not whom they appear to be or should be, that they're untrustworthy, that they're biased, that they're bigoted or incompetent, just anything negative. It's very hard to send a negative signal to someone else and have them interpret it in a way that they could be offended. And so that emotional state where we become so concerned about offending the other person or the relationship concerns or the social norms that it holds us back. We don't want to insinuate that the other person is anything but great. We want to save their face. So that's one reason. The other reason is
Can I jump in?
sure, yeah.
Can I jump in? And I have some questions about that reason. So hold the other two. We will get to
Okay.
them. Um, so number one, I imagine there's some adaptiveness to this default that we have, that there's some utility to us having that anxiety. Would you agree, disagree?
Yeah, I mean that uncomfortable feeling is there for a reason. That we have what is known as two ideal selves. So Marcus Hazel and Shinobu Kitayama came up with these two ideal selves. Like one is the ideal independent self, where we want to do how we feel, like we want to have our agency, we want to speak up if we disagree with something. And then we have our ideal interdependent self, where we care about harmonious relationships and other people and not hurting their feelings. And the two are always in some kind of tension because we can never reach either ideal, and we probably don't want to reach either ideal. And so that uncomfortable feeling is there for a reason because it makes us think about the consequences of our actions. But it does become problematic when it is a situation that perhaps harms you, harms other people in the room, or perhaps people that are not in the room, and you don't do anything because in that moment you're so concerned about saving the face of the particular person that it overrides everything else. So you zoom in a little bit too much. But yes, it's there for a reason and it can be helpful in certain situations.
One other follow-up question, we'll get to number two. Help me feel better about myself at home. Because when I think about insinuation anxiety and my kids, sometimes I think it may be missing to some degree. They have no problem telling me when they disagree with me and are just happy to step up to the plate. So I imagine that in the family dynamic, that some of these rules operate maybe a little bit differently, given the comfort between parents and kids or partners and partners.
You know, it could go either way in that when you have this close relationship with someone, you might be even more concerned about not insinuating something. So
Mm.
I have hypothesized like a U-shaped curve of like if it's a total stranger, I've seen insinuation anxiety. Maybe if you're very comfortable with someone, it's not, but maybe if you're too close, so I still have to test that hypothesis to see if it's true. But I've seen insinuation anxiety in my experiments with total strangers with no power dynamic that it's present. It also happens when there is a power dynamic when you go to see your doctor and those kind of scenarios, insinuation anxiety is high. And in my interviews, like people experience it in so many different situations. So it could be that you experience it more with a loved one, or perhaps not. So maybe your children don't experience it with you, but I've had parents tell me that they actually experience it when they're talking to their child. So it could go in either direction.
So interesting. So interesting. So in other words, my kids are outliers. It's okay. Um,
Well, they could be
uh,
positively defiant, right? So when we talk
hey,
about, yeah, when we talk about
yeah,
defiance in
let's
kids,
and let's hold that because we'll get to
okay.
defiant in a second. But they will like that interpretation. Um, so let's go to number two, though. What was your number two? You said there were three factors that could help explain
Oh, yes.
this
So,
phenomenon.
yes, the first one is social pressure. So, perhaps insinuation anxiety amongst that. The second one is that we don't really understand what compliance and defiance actually are. So we misunderstand what it means to defy, and we there's a difference between consent and compliance, even though the two are often conflated. So we really need to get good understanding of these different concepts.
Tell us more.
Okay. So to comply is really to simply go along with somebody else's expectations, perhaps society's expectations, or a direct order. It could be even a non-verbal order. It's just something that we're going along with because of some external reason. But it's
Mhm.
not something that we truly want to do in a lot of these circumstances. We often slide into it without thinking, or it's something that we just go along with, but wish that we didn't have to. Consent is fundamentally different to compliance. So consent is not compliance. I actually take the definition of informed consent in medicine, where I used to work as a physician in the UK's National Health Service. And I take that definition from medicine because I think it's really useful to apply it to the decisions that we make in our everyday lives or really important decisions. And for informed consent, you need 5 elements. So the first one is capacity. Whenever physicians assess patients, they need to have the mental capacity to make a decision. So you want to make sure that you're not too sick, you're not succumbed with illness or drugs or alcohol. You have the mental capacity to make a decision. That's the first one. The second one is knowledge. So you need information to make an informed decision. So you need information about so for example, your friend at the dinner table, they need to have information that the person actually meant this, what it means, context, all those different kinds of things. So it's not just being given the information, you also need understanding. So you need to know the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives of the decision that you're going to make. And then the fourth one is the freedom. If somebody is expecting you to say yes to something or expecting some compliance, you need the freedom to say no in order to consent. Because if you don't have the freedom to say no, then that's not consent. It's merely compliance. And then if you have all of those 4 elements, so you have the capacity, the knowledge, the understanding, and the freedom to say no, then the 5th element is your authorization. If you want to go ahead and you have all those elements present, that's your authorization yes, what I call a true yes or consent. If you want to say no, then that's what I say is your true no, or it's your dissent, it's your defiance. So both consent and defiance are thoroughly considered authorizations that are active expressions of our deeply held values. So very different from compliance.
Mm. Okay, and just to round it out, why don't you give us our third, and then I want to ask you a personal question.
Okay. So the third one is once you decide to defy and you want to defy, you don't know how to defy. So you haven't practiced enough. You don't have the skill set. Or if you were like me, having been socialized to be very compliant and grew up with what I say is a masterclass of compliance, you need to develop those skills to be able to defy. And all of those reasons could be why your friend didn't speak up at that dinner table.
So when we started this presentation, I saw a picture of a little girl who um, looked like she was an expert at defying. Um, when you look at that picture, that of course was you,
Yes.
that little girl. And so you just said that you had a master class in the opposite of this skill. So tell us a little bit about what really lit, kind of lit that light bulb for you, that the way in which you were socialized may not have actually been optimal for helping you live the life that you think is meaningful, that you want to live.
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm surprised that you thought I looked very defiant in that photograph because I was so compliant as a child. I was known for being an obedient daughter and a student. So, I think in that particular photograph, I um, I think my brother had said that I was given this giant lollipop and I was saving it. So there was some delayed gratification there, or I was very analytical. So I was probably thinking about something, but I was really socialized to be compliant. I remember asking my dad at some point when I was young, what does my name mean? And he said, in Sanskrit, Sunita actually means good. And so mostly I lived up to that. I did what I was told. I went to school on time. I did my homework as expected. I even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted me to. I was very compliant, but I was actually really fascinated by the people that could defy and how they could defy so much more easily than I could. And in fact, like my first career was in medicine, and that was mainly due to expectations. So I was told medicine is the best thing you can do. And even though I had doubts and I was more of a researcher and analytical, that's what I did. I went to medical school, I finished medical school, I ended up working as a doctor and then found the path. And I suppose there was some defiance there to do the research that I really wanted to do. And
And so was that the turning point for you? Was that when you first thought and became conscious of the significance of defiance and the difficulty people have with it, or did that come later?
You know, when I was at medical school in the UK, it's a combined undergraduate and graduate degree. So it's at the time that I did it, it was five years long, so 5 year medical degree. But in my third year of that degree, I took a year out and did psychology. So we could get an intercalated degree. They kind of throw you in the fourth year of psychology and expect you to do 4 years in one. But that year was absolutely amazing. I really loved it. And it was then when I came across the Milgram experiments, the obedience to authority, where uh, Milgram really wanted to bring people in and examine whether the just following orders from the Nazis after World War II were a psychological reality or not. And so he set up this experiment, this based on sort of learning, and wondered whether participants would give what they thought were harmful electric shocks to another person. So that experiment I kind of poured over during that time. And I was really fascinated by what he called not just the obedient subjects, which were the ones that did shock the other participants up to the highest volt level of 450 volts, but the ones that actually said no, the defiant, what he called the defiant subjects. And here you can see the reframing of defiance as something positive. They're not going to harm another person. So that was really fascinating to me, as well as the obedient subjects and how much tension that they expressed. So Milgram would describe the fact that they had this nervous laughter, a lot of tension. They were sweating at times, muttering, swearing, all these things that showed them that they were doing what they thought the experimenter wanted them to do. They were obeying, but they didn't really want to. And I recognized myself in those experiments because whenever I complied, when I didn't want to, I felt this tension. And it was that tension that really motivated and drove a lot of the research that I do now. So that kind of drove me down this path of looking at compliance and defiance because I recognize those moments where they were trying to defy, but they just couldn't get there.
So when I'm hearing you talk, and I can't help but think about the times in my life where I've been in this position where, I could defy or not. And it seems like there's a constant need to balance between the benefits that one derives for the self from standing up for what they believe in and the potential social ramifications that occur from defying. How do we balance those two? Is there a simple decision rule? There often isn't in psychology, but can you give us some guidelines for how to navigate that space? Because I think what makes this so unbelievably tricky and why so many of us struggle with this is because it's not always clear what to prioritize, the self or the relationship. So
Exactly.
illuminate us, please, because I
Yes,
personally would
yes.
benefit greatly from it.
Yeah, because if you think about, and we can use the example that you started this session off with because it's a good one to use. It's like, what do you do in that situation? So many of us, like the first stage of defiance when that I've identified is that tension. So something happens, you're asked to do something or you hear something that you think is unjust or unethical, and you feel some tension and think, I need to, well, actually, that's just the first stage. So we'll end there. And then if you start thinking about what do I do in this situation, there's a number of questions that can come up. And I have what I call the defiance compass, which has sort of three main questions. So the first one is, who am I? And that's really connecting with yourself. And this is work you can do long before like a moment of crisis where you need to act in the moment. So ask yourself, who are you, right? What are your values? Because when I ask my executive students to write down their values after all the groans and everything about having to do a value-based exercise, they actually find it quite transformative in the fact that most of them develop their values from some incident that they had in their childhood or something that they can determine is really important to them. And if they can write down and say what their values are and why they're important to them, that's actually the first step, because a lot of the time we have a gap between who we are and what we actually do. And so writing those values down actually makes it more likely that our intended behaviors will follow through if we are very clear about our values. It also lowers our stress reactions. So research has shown that there's lower cortisol levels if you know who you are and what your values are. And usually I get the same ones from my students year after year. They sort of boil down to sort of simple words, but very powerful ones if we can enact them day in, day out. So they're things like integrity, compassion, equality, benevolence. These values are really powerful, but can we live up to them? So when we're in a situation, then we can ask ourselves, what type of situation is this? So really understanding the situation that we're in. So first of all, would it be safe for me to defy? Because not all situations are safe. Some are not physically safe, but you also do want to assess some of the costs that you were talking about. So what are the psychological costs? What are the maybe financial costs? Am I going to lose a relationship? Am I going to lose a job? You want to assess those costs so you can make the decision with those costs in mind. And we can talk a little bit more about that because we always do think about the cost of defiance and they are real and they are there, but there's also costs for compliance and disregarding your values. So is it safe? And will it be effective? So that's the second question when you're in the situation. Is it safe and is it going to be effective? Because there's many different things you could do in that situation at the dinner table. Perhaps that is the right time and place. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps you want to address that later on. In a work meeting, for example, some of these things you can predict. So perhaps you are in a meeting and you know that this particular person is going to make an inappropriate remark because it's happened again and again and again. And there's actually a really insightful example that I read in a book called How Professors Behave by Michelle Lamont, where she talks about.
Oh, I'm naturally curious about this
Yes,
contribution now.
absolutely. This is why I remember it so well. So it was about a committee that had been put together to assess grant applications. And there were four sort of senior men and one woman. And it was her first time in this meeting with these four people. It's the first time she's met these men. And when it came to one particular application, she felt like the discussion was going off of gossip rather than the credibility of the application. And so she was like your friend that she wanted to say something and she didn't. The moment passed, there were a couple of moments and she was just silent the entire time. And after the meeting, she said, the one thing that I wanted to do was the one thing I couldn't do. And I couldn't just sit there and question their integrity, which is exactly insinuation anxiety, right? She didn't want to insinuate that they didn't know what they were doing, that they were untrustworthy, that they were incompetent. It was just so difficult. But you can see there that there could be some harm if the applicant is being assessed by gossip and not by actual credentials. It could harm the applicant. We don't know what would happen to that applicant's career after that. There is harm being done. And often we can predict situations where somebody is going to say something because we've been in that situation before. Or perhaps your friend has been at that dinner and that particular person has said that kind of thing over and over again. And so when we don't speak up, all these moments of not speaking up, all these moments of complying actually teach us something. Like it teaches us what factors enable our defiance and what factors disable it. Because often it's surprise that disables defiance. But if we then know and we can prepare for that, then we can practice. Because even the most famous no's, like Rosa Parks saying no to moving on the bus, even she had many moments of compliance before that where she did move, right? So it's fine if we've complied in the past as long as we start learning. And then the last question that really tells you, should I defy or not, is what does a person like me, going back to who am I, my values, what does a person like me with these values, who I aspire to be, a person with integrity, fairness, compassion, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? And that question is really powerful. I've found that really helps us decide, is this a situation where I should speak up or not? And what we're really asking is this situation going against my values? Is it going to be harmful to someone? Is this something that I need to address?
Would you say that there is an art to defying well, in the sense that I've been in situations where the defiance, it is clear, it is direct, buckle up when you're like, whoa, what just happened here? And the person who said something that was insensitive and all the other negative things that accompany it, they are put in their place and mission accomplished from the defier. But it has come at some social cost. There's some discomfort in the room and it's palpable, the tension. Then I've been in other situations where the defier takes a kind of meandering, well, I'm not sure if I agree. And I've thought about it. Have you ever thought about it this way? Basically, trying to get the person who has uttered something that violates one's own integrity and view of the world to right the ship, to alter their views, or maybe find a new way of making sense of things, but it's a little bit less in one's face. Different strokes for different folks. Are there different ways of doing this skillfully? Is one better than the other? What would you coach someone to do?
Well, when you ask, is it an art? It's definitely a skill set. And so one of the myths about defiance is that it is loud and aggressive and violent, and you have to have this larger than life personality to be defiant. And what I've really found is that defiance isn't a personality, it's a practice, it's a skill set that we can choose to use or not. And then the second part of what you're asking is like, how do we defy? And if in my 5 stages of defiance, like the first stage I said is tension. Often we try to get rid of that tension by not acknowledging it, by thinking it's not worth our doubt. We're just going to ignore it. It will go away. It's fine to comply. The other person knows better. We think all these things. But the second stage is really acknowledging it to ourselves. Yes, I feel this tension. I feel uncomfortable, and assessing the situation. Perhaps this is something I need to address. Like, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? But the third stage is where it becomes interesting and critical, because the third stage of defiance is vocalizing that to somebody else. And it could be the person who's expecting you to just comply or remain silent or agree with you. And there's numerous ways to do that. And I do recommend in this stage curiosity rather than confrontation. So just asking questions. So the second sort of way that you were talking about, so asking questions such as, what do you mean by that? Can you clarify? Have you considered this way? Or what do you think about? So it's asking some questions there and maybe saying, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. So just these, in this stage, you're still in the subservient position. You're not sort of confronting the person, telling them off, or you're not saying that you're not even going to comply with it. You're asking questions and you're just vocalizing some discomfort. And why that stage is so critical, if you can get to that stage, then you're more likely to get to stage 5 because you've expressed something externally and verbally, which means you can't go back and say, oh, I was actually fine with it. I never thought there was anything wrong with it. That would be too much cognitive dissonance. So that third stage is really critical. And how you do that can be a skill that can be practiced. So it doesn't, again, need to be violent. You can be defiant in your own unique way.
Yeah, I love the emphasis on curiosity. I've had that. I've been the target of that, and when people adopt that kind of curious mind role, I mean, it's pretty amazing um, how it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. So let me ask you another question, and I'm going to target your own personal experiences here. So you started off life and spent a significant chunk of your early life not being defiant. You were compliant, right? I mean, using the
I was
right
compliant.
term,
Yeah.
you were compliant. And in knowing you a little bit, you do not strike me as um, you're still compliant to some degree, but you have no hesitation to be defiant when necessary, which is to say, you've gotten a lot better at this as time has gone on. And my question for you is, you outlined 5 steps to becoming better at defiant. Oftentimes, in the heat of the moment, we do not have time to go through those 5 steps. Have you found that the more you've practiced these steps in your own life, the more automatic it has become, so that right now it's second nature, almost reflexive for you to detect some integrity violations and then immediately slip into this curiosity mindset when interacting with others?
Yeah. So the reason I was so compliant is because of the way that I was brought up. So I started equating sort of being compliant with being good and being defiant with being bad. And that sort of equation to me, like it was almost like a moral equation that you can't be defiant because that would be bad. And that was the lesson that I learned. And that's why it became very difficult for me to be defiant because of that self-concept of, I don't want to be bad. But then, when I saw some of the things that were happening around me and I looked into the research a little bit more and I saw how, even if you just look at the milligram experiments, you can start to wonder, is it sometimes bad to be so good? And the way that I started to become more defiant is really trying to understand why I was so compliant in the first place and how other people could get to sort of that final stage of defiance. And practice was the key aspect of this because if I was like wired to comply and all my neural pathways and my default reaction was to be compliant, it was really to interrupt that. And the best way to do that really is by practicing. Because if we can predict that, oh, I'm going to be, I wish I hadn't said that in that situation. Or I wish, even as a medical doctor, I complied with a procedure that I didn't want to take, even though I had the full knowledge and understanding in that situation. It was just so hard for me to say no to the doctor, even though that was my right? With informed consent, I should be able to say no. I'd rather not have that. The risks outweigh the benefits. And yet I went along with it. When that happened in one situation, I really started to think about why that happened and why I said yes. And I thought, next time I'm in this situation, this is what I'm going to do. So if you can anticipate the types of situations that you are likely to be in and that require defiance, then you can start visualizing it. You can start role playing or scripting and practicing that because it's those things that change the neural pathways that make it easier for us to be defiant. Because as I learned in this really fantastic sort of presentation workshop that I went to, your mouth has to get used to saying those words and your ears have to get used to hearing it. And that is what we need, is that kind of practice. Like, what do I wish I had said? What is my aspirational self in that situation? And practicing for those means that in the moment of crisis, those words come a little bit easier. What do you mean by that? I'm not comfortable with this. Those things come a little bit easier. I still feel the tension at times. There are some things I can be defiant on that become more natural for me. So, for example, I can speak up much more easily for my son than I can for myself because I can immediately connect with my responsibility and values and the fact that, you know, I don't want any harm to come to him. So if we're in a medical situation with my son, I'm much more likely to speak up and say, is that really necessary? What about this? Have you considered this? In a way that often I find it more difficult to do for myself. But recognizing those aspects about myself, identifying what helps me speak up and in what format is really transformative for me.
So I want to shift a little bit from talking about what we can do to become more defiant ourselves, strengthening this muscle in the way you just described, to talking about what we can do for others to help them become more defiant, using that word in the way that I think you are intending to shift the way we use it in a very positive way. And this brings me to the topic of culture, which I think should be directly relevant to lots of folks who are listening in, because we've got lots of people who are parts of families on this call. And when I think of family, I think about that as a kind of culture. And you described growing up in a culture, your family, that really shaped you to be more compliant and less defiant. When I think back to some of the pivotal moments in my professional training in graduate school, one that really sticks out to me is when my one of my mentors said in the context of a lab meeting very early on, I want you to disagree with me when I say something that doesn't resonate with you. I don't want you to just yes me to death, right? Tell me. Essentially, he's encouraging us to defy. And what that did is it really licensed us to do that. And I try to create that kind of culture in my own lab as well, right? Like, come at me, disagree with me when I say something that doesn't sit well with you. Does that make it easier for us to defy? And what happens when we find ourselves not in cultures like that, in our professional or even friendship circles, but rather cultures that are more similar to the one that you grew up in, that do place a real emphasis on compliance? How do we deal with those kinds of states? So I realize I just stacked questions for you, and you could take either one, whichever one you prefer first.
Oh, I'll start with the first one and see if I remember the second one by the time I've finished.
I might have forgotten it too, so we may go on to
So,
something else.
so the first question is, if I'm remembering now, so the culture, right? Like, how can we set up that type of culture for others as a parent, as a boss, as a manager?
And does it
And
make a difference? Does it make a difference
oh
if we set it
yes,
up?
it makes a huge difference. So that type of culture makes a massive difference, I would say. If, for example, what we tend to do as parents and teachers is that we want children to comply a lot of the time because, I even remember, even with this upbringing, sort of when I was in London in 2012 and it was the Olympics and my son was about 4 and I wanted to see the Olympic flame held up by the athletes. And I was really so delighted that this like the Olympics had come to London and there was this great atmosphere. And I was taking my son to see the flame, and I was like, "Oh, this is a once in a lifetime experience. It's going to be history in making. You're going to love this." And he did not look convinced at all. And it was a really hot day, hot for London, right? And it was crowded on the street. And he just stopped walking and he sat down on the pavement and he said, "I don't want to go. I want to go home." And I got really frustrated. I was trying to pull him, I was trying to carry him, but he was too heavy. And I was like, "Come on, we're going to miss it. Let's go, let's go." And he just was not having it. So we did, unfortunately, miss the flame. And then we sort of
Hmm.
walked back home. And I said, "Why can't you just be good?" And then I remembered that, oh, this is the same equation that I received growing up, that being compliant is being good and being defiant is being bad. So this wasn't all about values here, but it was, you know, being compliant is doing what I want, right? And that we often think that about babies. When he was a little baby and he was born, there was well-meaning relatives that would ask, "Is he good?" And I would be like, "What do you mean? He's a baby." And they meant, does he sleep when you want him to? Does he eat when you want him to? Does he do what you want him to? And so we don't often train our children for defiance. And I think we miss an opportunity there because we don't want everyone to be compliant. It can be so harmful to society if everybody's compliant. If everybody's compliant, there's no creativity or innovation. We want people to speak up if something is wrong, right? We want nurses to speak up if they see their peers or doctors making an error. And we're not seeing that in the research that I've conducted. So many nurses don't feel safe to speak up or they don't feel it's effective. So creating that environment where it's safe and effective for people to speak up is really important. And it could be as simple as what your graduate advisor said, "Come on, disagree with me, tell me things that are wrong." And then not obviously not penalizing people for speaking up. So there's that psychological safety there, but also that it's effective. When people do speak up, you actually listen, you take action, you don't just ignore it. So it's not effective. So that's great to create that kind of environment. Now you can remind me the second question.
No, no, no. Let's stick with this one because
Okay.
you make a couple of points that I want to follow up on. So, one thing I just want to clarify is that if you welcome defiance, this does not mean that everything that comes out of your mouth is going to be challenged by someone else who is receiving that information, right? So creating a culture of defiance, when I think about it, is not one where there's constantly combativeness between individuals in a group. It is simply affording people the opportunity to speak their mind, to speak their truth, if you will, when they find it challenged in some way. Is that a fair characterization of this? 'Cause I think it's important to point out we're not trying to get people to always fight with each other.
No, exactly. And I think what would be helpful here is my definition of defiance, because what I my research and everything that I discovered over the last couple of decades is that if we've what really changed how I think is that we've misunderstood what it means to defy. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines defiant, like to defy is to challenge the power of somebody else, like openly and boldly. And this is what most people think, right? This is what we're talking about. Is it confrontation? What are we doing? And I'm not one to really disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary, having grown up in the UK, but I do think that definition is way too narrow and it doesn't really honor our agency. And so my definition of defiance is that to defy is to act in accordance with your values when there is pressure to do otherwise. So that transforms defiance into a proactive, positive social force for society. Because if you think about society, every single act of consent and dissent that we do every day, our decisions, they create the society that we live in. And so that's why it becomes so important. If somebody is saying something, if somebody is making a sexist remark or a bigoted remark, if we let it slide or we say something, it's a decision that we have to make, whether it's going to be effective or not in that situation and whether that's the right situation. But all of these things create the society that we live in. And that's why it's so important. It affects our lives, our workplaces, our communities.
Couldn't agree more. Um, so one other question on the culture, what happens when we find ourselves in a culture that is like your family growing up, that really does place a premium on compliance? What is the prescription there? Do we operate by the same motivation to be defiant when we feel the need to do so, or do we adjust?
You know what's fascinating when I think about my upbringing is that there were all these expectations to be compliant, but how much did I really test being defiant in that environment to see whether it actually did have the consequences that I feared that it might? And even though I saw my parents as being quite compliant as well, there have been some situations that they showed some defiance, and that really had an impact on me. So, one of them, I was about 6 or 7. I was walking home from the grocery store with my mum, and we had our rickety shopping cart that she was pulling. It just looks like sort of wheeled luggage that you might take to the airport, 2 wheels. And we were walking home, which is quite a long way, and we wanted to take a shortcut. And so we decided to go through what you call a snicket in Yorkshire, which is just like a narrow alleyway. So we went through this alleyway and we were confronted by a group of teenage boys, and they blocked our path and they shouted out some offensive things to us and told us to go back home. Now, when I think about my mum, she's quite petite. She's 4'10" at the most. She was wearing her blue sari and she had her hair neatly plaited in one plait, one braid at the back. And I thought of her as compliant. At that point in my life, I viewed sort of compliance and defiance as binary, and I'd very much put her in the compliant box. So she did all the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping, and she was always looking after everybody else's needs. Like, she was extremely subservient, generous, kind. And when this happened, my reaction to the boys were instant. So I grabbed her arm and I wanted to look away. I averted my gaze and I just wanted to maneuver as fast as possible through those boys. But she stopped and she asked them, "What do you mean?" So that one simple question, she asked them that. And then my heart started racing. I was like, whoa. And I grabbed her arm even tighter and I whispered to her, "Come on, Ma." And she said, "No." And I'd never heard her say that in that way to me. She said, "No." And she shrugged off my arm and she put the shopping cart up vertical. She put one hand on her hip and she looked back at the boys and she said, "What do you mean?" And there was just silence. And the boys didn't say anything. They started looking at each other. And then she said, "Oh, so you think you're big tough boys, clever boys, right?" And they still didn't say anything. And I could not believe that she was talking back to well, I wouldn't even say talking back, that she was talking to these boys in this way, that she just didn't remain silent or walk through. And then one of the boys looked at the other and he just said, "Let's go." And they dispersed. My mum grabbed the shopping cart and then started walking fast through that alleyway. And I stood there sort of really shocked and frozen and then ran up to catch up with her. But what that really showed me is that defiance isn't a personality, it's practice, it's a skill set that we can choose to utilize or not. And even though compliance might be our default, like it was for me, like I thought it was for my mom, and I still think it is, even if compliance is our default, it's not our destiny. We can build it up as a practice. We can test those situations because I'm pretty sure she had met those boys before and something was different that day. She tested the environment. I was there. And even though defiance sort of transforms you, it makes you more the person you want to be. It also really changes the people who observe it because that her act of defiance that day stayed with me. It had this ripple effect, which is really important. And when I talk about the type of society that we want to create, ideally, we're building a society where one of the teens can speak up and say, tell his peers to stop doing what they're doing. That is the type of society I want. If the teen can speak up and tell his friends to stop this, so my immigrant mother wouldn't have to, I think that's what I really hope for with this book is to make defiance accessible to everyone so we can all choose to utilize it and we can sort of change our parenting in a way that makes it acceptable. So if we can build those cultures, that's great. If we're not in that culture, we can test the environment a little bit the way that my mum did, get to that stage 3. What do you mean by that? Ask those questions. And if it really is far too consequential to speak up, think about changing that culture. And if you need to, leave it.
I love how first of all, it's a beautiful story. So I was really just, you should keep telling it because it is quite powerful. Um, I love how you break down being defiant into different stages. It's not just this in your face, I disagree, sit down, you're wrong. I think that invites people to start practicing this more in their lives. Inevitably, like practicing any skill, there are going to be moments where we fail, where we fail to be defiant. We screw up. We've got the intentions. We don't follow through with it. What's your advice to people, the people on this call, the interviewer who is interviewing right now? What's your advice to all of us when we fail to live up to those ideals?
I think that we will at times, right? If we have an aspirational self, we will fail. I fail at times. This skill is difficult and it's maybe more difficult to some than others if you haven't practiced. So I don't think you should have like all this judgment and shame on yourself if you fail. Like we already ruminate and say, "Oh, I wish we'd done differently in that situation." And that is what can help us. Like what was it that didn't enable me to defy in that situation? Those situations where I have failed make it easier for me to be more successful next time. It's like, okay, now I recognize this tension. I recognize this situation. I couldn't do it last time. Why not? I'm going to practice for this situation and be ready for this. And that goes back to the importance of practice again. It's a practice, not a personality. And there is this wonderful quote that I always go back to because I think it's so important when we think about defiance as a practice. And it's often attributed to Bruce Lee, but it's a Greek poet that said, under duress, We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. So that is the importance of practice.
Yeah, that's a powerful, powerful quote that does put it in perspective right there. I think you've just given people another gift right here, which is when we fail, which inevitably we're going to, uh, just learn from it, get back on the bicycle, and the more you do practice it, the better you're going to become. How much better have you become? When you think about your ability to navigate this tension between defying and complying in your life? Has it been like the stock market, an upward trajectory with maybe some kind of undulations up and down, but continually upward sloping, or has it taken some other shape? Um,
No, I haven't really thought about it. That mean I would love it to be like, whew, and I become like the perfect aspirational version of myself that I want to be in those situations. But I think some situations are easier than others, and it will be unique for each person because I also had a self-concept of being extremely compliant. And then I did this exercise with people where I asked them, what do you think it is that I love? And people would write these things and say, oh, you're not afraid to say what you think, you follow your own path. And like there were some things that, when you ask them, what do you think I value? There were some things that I completely resonated with, right, with the work that I do. But there were this aspect of being able to speak your mind, it kind of surprised me because that wasn't my self-concept. And we had a job candidate come in sort of several years ago and I was taking her from one interview to the next, and I was walking across the grass with her. And she said to me, how come you break all the rules? And I looked at her and I thought, what do you mean? Like, I do exactly what I'm told. I'm very compliant, I keep my head down. And like, she was like, no, you publish in medical journals as well as management ones, and we're told not to do that. And then I suddenly realized you're right. I have been told that I'm not going to be rewarded as much for publishing in medical journals, and I should steer my papers towards these particular journals and not these ones. And I never actually registered that much because I always wanted to publish in the place that I thought was best for that particular paper, that it would have the most impact. And then I realized I jumped from maybe I did have some tension when people were telling me exactly which journals I could publish in. And I've jumped right from like stage 2 to stage 5 in that was not as hard for me because I could really connect with the values that I wanted. That, with my background, of course, I'm going to publish in medical journals as well as management journals, regardless of where my tenure home is. And I think there are situations where we find it easier. So that was a situation I found easier. I find it easier again to sort of defy for my son, so defying for loved ones. And we can see the situations where we do find it easier and tap into that. Like, and really think about what makes it easier for us in that situation. What are the factors? And what is the situation that I would like to be practice more defiance in?
One final question, and then we're going to throw it back to Lonnie. We haven't really talked yet about the role that other people in our lives play in helping us overcome the challenges to defy in specific moments. I know personally, I have often found it incredibly useful to lean on my emotional advisors, if you will, when I'm really struggling with a time where I think I should defy or maybe I didn't. Is that something that you advocate?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Sometimes in the moment, I always advocate for the power of what I call the power of the pause, is that we want to stop and we really want to think about that. And we could turn to other people. Um, What else I do advise if you can't get any physical distance from the person expecting something of you is some psychological distance. So there's some amazing work done by Dr. Kross on self-talk and talking to yourself as the third person and saying, what Sunita, what is the right thing to do in this situation? What is it that you really want? What are your values? And that really helps. But emotional advisors sounds excellent, Ethan. I'm sure I've turned to you at times to ask you what should I do in this situation, and you've been my defiance help, and I hope I am a defiant help to others too.
I'm sure you are a help to all 100 and change people who have been on this call. Um, Sunita, we've spoken quite a bit independently this meeting here about your work, and um, I can't tell you how powerful it was to hear you tell the stories that you told, which I have never heard you say before. So thank you for sharing it, and just thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I think it is gonna help a lot of people on this planet. So um, I'm eager to hear. Oh, well, that's maybe my cue to just
No, go ahead. I'm eager
no.
to hear what you're eager to hear.
Oh, I'm eager. I'm eager to hear what everyone who has been listening has to say about this, because I'm
So
sure they're going to have tons of questions.
I
So
will.
thank you for your work and your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Ethan. This has been a very enjoyable conversation, and thank you so much for hosting, moderating.
Ethan, again, also I ditto that. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and attentive conversation with Sunita. It's we do a lot of events, and if I could bottle what you just did and hand it out to every interview partner, it would be great for Fan and great for those listening. So thank you so much for your time tonight. And we look forward to when Shift comes out, which is a fabulous book. I read it when I was in London in December, and it's just beautiful. So we look forward to getting a final date with you, whether it's on Zoom or in person. We'd love to see you in person. We're just hoping this cold weather lets up at some point.